Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have with me Jan Alexander. Jan, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I am thrilled to be here.
Jan lives on the outskirts of the hill country, but close enough for her comfort. So we are going to chat about Jan's work, how she became a professional writer, and let's talk about some of her books. So, Jan, could you tell us your academic and professional background before you started writing full time?
All right. Sure thing. So I went to the University of Maryland and got a BS there in commercial design, as it was called then. And I ended up fulfilling a 30-year career there in the DC area, doing art direction and design for initially advertising and then editorial projects like magazines and communications for companies that were largely on the editorial side. And when I moved to Austin, I had retired from that career and I really was taken with the architecture and the uniqueness and the character of Austin and began photographing it, painting, and for a while had a series called Vanishing Austin and photographing as quickly as I could all the cool, hip places that were disappearing slowly. Eventually kind of outgrew that and I turned to writing.
I lived in Austin from 1975 to 1979. And even back then, we used to say, keep Austin weird. It's been weird for
Yeah.
a long time and cool for a long time. As I tell people, I was there before 6th Street became 6th Street.
And
I
now
grew
they're
up in,
and now they're trying to do away with 6th Street as 6th Street, but go ahead, sorry.
I grew up in a town, he was bigger than my hometown. So I thought I had died and gone to heaven when I got to Austin. But tell us about your writing. What led you to wanting to do professional writing? Was it a lifelong passion? Was it something you wanted to explore? You'd obviously been writing in your professional career for clients, but now you got the chance to write for yourself. So tell us about that part of your journey.
Yeah, that was fun. I was a writer early on. As a child, I wrote short stories and books, and I self-published my first novel in 8th grade called Eric and the Smugglers. And in those days, I had to typeset it myself, i.e., the typewriter that belonged to my dad, and saddle stitch it myself with my own stapler and do the illustrations. But that was kind of the end of my book career until I moved to Austin and I began writing a blog. I was so enchanted with the things that were going around and that I was seeing in Austin that I began blogging about that and blogging about creativity. And that really helped me practice my writing skills. And at the same time, I got super interested in Texas history. So I would write short stories and blog posts about my travels around Texas that always weaned them back into history of Texas. And I've written one novel before this, which I hope will be published soon by my publisher. And this novel I wrote took about 10 years because of the deep research I went into, probably more than I needed to. But now I have a vast archive of Texas history. And that novel is called Unspoken. It's the one that's releasing July 3rd.
And who's your publisher for Unspoken?
The publisher is Black Rose Writing, and they're a small press outside of San Antonio. And
I've written a lot of books in the business space, all nonfiction, business ethics, corporate compliance, things like that. And I have tried fiction, but I've never actually completed a novel. But when I write fiction, my writing process is very different than when I write nonfiction. I literally close my eyes and see the story in my head, and I'm almost feel like I'm just reporting a show. How do you do it? Obviously, you're very meticulous in your research. Is that part of it almost like a nonfiction book, or do you have some other creative process that you use?
That's this is you're inspiring great questions. And I think a lot of it comes from being a visual person first and foremost. It sounds like you are too, because I can really visualize everything as I'm writing it. But the research came in where it just sort of inspired me to put the obstacles in the paths of the characters that really needed it to they needed to surmount all these obstacles in order to transition and become more wholesome, healthy human beings eventually. And so the research really gave me a sense of what the times would be like and what the atmosphere would be like, what the smells and senses were, all of those things, what the historical events were, as well as just immersing me in how it would feel to be a person living then. And that really helped me with my writing. And there's, I'm sure you feel this way too, but you live long enough and there are certain pivotal things that never leave your brain and certain memories that you have. And in my case, in the late 70s, there was a film it was made starring David Carradine, and it was about the life of Woody Guthrie. And it featured Woody Guthrie's early time he lived in Pampa, Texas. And the Black Sunday dust storm hit the home. And the way it was filmed was astonishing. And that visual never left my mind. So I think as I was exploring Texas history, I became more interested in that era because of that particular visual and being able to understand how that would feel and what that would look like and be like.
I think most people of us Americans of a certain age are incredibly familiar with The Grapes of Wrath, whether it was the book or
Mhm.
the movie or both. And that told the story of the Okies. Now, the Great Depression and the dust storms of the 30s hit all through the Midwest. Steinbeck made the Okies perhaps the most famous. So, why did you choose Texas as opposed to Oklahoma or even Kansas to focus on the Black Sunday dust storm part of this story?
It's interesting. The Okies are maybe the smallest portion of people that really left the Plains states, and their story is very well known just because of Steinbeck. And we all had to read that in high school, so we all know that book. But the panhandle of Texas and the panhandle of Oklahoma, where the two meet, really were the epicenter of the Dust Bowl in general. They were always the area that was hardest hit, although the Dust Bowl did affect maybe 5 states, all in all, part of Colorado and New Mexico, but primarily Texas, Oklahoma, and then some of Kansas, and sometimes even up into South Dakota. Because it was the epicenter, there's probably been the most studied on it and done about it. And of course, Woody Guthrie made it famous with all of his songs and the film Bound for Glory that I cited. And I felt like I could understand the characters there, and I began researching it. And the most fun when you're researching is to find somebody's not a bestseller, just somebody's book they wrote about their life or their times, or something that was nobody notable in history that really caught the public's attention, but you're not reading the reporting others have done about it. They're really first person accounts. And I found a couple of terrific books that were first person accounts and of that area and what it was like growing up there. And it was just so vivid and real to me that I knew I wanted to put my characters in that town and in that place and time. And then try to throw obstacles at them. What would it be like? How would they deal with it? And they wouldn't be like Okies. They would be the ones that stick their feet in the dirt and refuse to leave. This may be not the best judgment call after 5 years of drought and dust wind and dust storms, but that was their approach. And I thought it would be more fascinating to look at that. So that's how I derived the characters and the plot.
So, the Black Sunday dust storm, you have characterized this as one of the defining moments in environmental history. Could you describe for our listeners and those watching us on YouTube what that event was and why it was so environmentally impactful when we've had a lot of environmentally impactful events?
I know, I think it's kind of lost to history a little bit. So many people I encounter say they didn't really know much about Black Sunday till I told them about it. But it occurred on April 14th, 1935, so we are approaching the 90th anniversary of it. And there had been about 5 years, depending on where you lived, about 5 years of very hideous dust storms where the soil just took to the air and giant amounts of dirt would fly through the air and they'd be carried like a massive cloud that came towards your town, and it could completely impact your ability to breathe or to continue to work or to live, really, if the dust got in your house, which it did in those days into most houses. And so when the Black Sunday storm came around, it was actually black, unlike any other dust storm yet. It was a black blizzard of dust, and it was just rolling and tumbling hundreds of feet high towards entire towns and just overtaking them and enveloping them in darkness, complete utter blackness. And people were terrified. Some people thought it was the end of the earth. Some people didn't know what to do. They weren't sure. Was it a tornado, a twister, whatever? And that particular dust storm it was one of many, but it was so significant that it made national news. And it really forced the hand of Congress to step up in a big way. And within a few weeks after it happened, Congress had passed the Soil Conservation Act, which created the Permanent Soil Conservation Agency. Now, today we know that is the Natural Resources Conservation Agency. But in those days, it was incredibly important to do something, anything to get all this eroded land that had been abandoned and was useless to get it under control and stop the dust storms.
What did you find in your research was the emotional impact on the people who had to live through this in the Texas Panhandle?
I think the people were of two kinds. Some were just bound and determined to look at the sky and say when it rains, and those were the farmers who had invested so much of their earnings and their livelihood in their farms and didn't want to give them up. And there were the others who kind of you said, "Okay, this is enough, and we're leaving." And of the ones who stayed, they experienced a lot of problems. It was hard to breathe when you were having dust storms every couple days, and it was getting into your house, and there was constant dirt on your kitchen utensils and on your tables and furniture. There was no keeping it out. And it caused a lot of health problems. So people had breathing problems. And the people who were the youngest or the most elderly were the ones who were prone to really dying from this. I think that many people, it's never even been figured out, died from it. So I think it was pretty tough because if they stayed, they were sort of between a rock and a hard place. If they left, they gave up any value they'd ever owned. And they were basically homeless, which so many people were. Over 500,000 people became homeless during that time. And if they stayed, they were putting their family members at risk from the quality of the air, not to mention poverty because people couldn't afford to eat if they couldn't get their crop to go and the businesses went under because people were abandoning the places. So it was really quite a disaster that we don't really think that much about today. But I think it's a pretty significant turnaround in what we as a country think we ought to be doing to preserve our environment and maintain our natural resources.
What was the economic impact? It's difficult for me to understand how farming could even continue with the 5-year or 6-year drought and then have all your topsoil blow away. What did farmers
Mhm.
do simply to survive? Or how did their livestock survive?
The livestock didn't survive, and at one point, the federal government had a program where they would pay the farmers $20 a head to shoot their cattle and get them basically because they thought they were overgrazing everything, and they felt it was one way that they could get some money back in the farmers' pockets who were starving to death. And the farmers were notorious for not wanting to take what they called the dole, so they didn't want a government handout. But anyway, a lot of farmers just stood around and helplessly watched their cows get shot. They couldn't get their crops to grow, so the banks came and took their land back, which then the farmers had nowhere to go. They left, but then the land was also abandoned and the soil took blow. So it wasn't, there weren't really that many solutions until the federal government got involved and sent some soil experts out to do some experiments, talk to some farmers and got them to agree to stay on and experiment with rotating crops or taking entire acreage out of crop and trying to grow natural native grasses back, which had always been there and survived all of this terrain. And I think one thing we forget is this is actual desert. This part of Texas is desert. Probably where you are, Tom, is considered almost considered desert. If you're the west of the 100th meridian, then that's officially considered desert in some parts of Texas. And drought is a natural part of it, or very little rainfall is a natural part of it. So it took a lot of intervention by the federal government to get people out from under it. And so many people were never made whole.
What did your research turn up in terms of the decisions people made to stay and the resiliency it took? Because after the war, certainly during the war, then after the war, they finally brought some other non-agricultural industries into that part of Texas, but that didn't happen for some time. So how did those people stay on, and did them staying on give them something they didn't have before because of that resilience they showed?
Yeah, I think the biggest factor that changed was the only way that the farmers could irrigate was we've all seen these windmills and these tanks. They just didn't have very deep access to water. But as World War II technology kind of came around and hit the area, they had the ability to dig deeper and deeper and get tap the underground water, which is the Ogallala Aquifer, which is underneath all of this area, and use that water to irrigate, and that's one way they managed to begin farming again, and of course, it's how we farm today. But I think that was part of it, and then there were government programs and help to support farmers if they agreed to turn the farms basically back to grasslands and let that kinda help take over too. And of course, there's ordinary people, there's other businesses that are in the towns that the farmers if the farmers are gone, the businesses can't really survive. So those people just were by a song and a prayer, and a lot of the people who were out of work, and that was a time when millions of Americans were also out of work because we were coming through the Great Depression. And a lot of the men and the boys just took to the rails and they rode the railroads around looking for jobs until eventually that was a way of life, just being a hobo riding the rails.
So could you give us a sort of a broad sweeping outline of the book, and equally, how did the events of the environment help shape the characters and your overall story?
Okay. Book opens on Black Sunday, again, because it was the biggest, blackest blizzard of all of them. And with a family who has held on for they've held on through the good years, no problem. But in these bad years of drought, they're really hanging on by their fingernails and burying two of their family members on the day that the Black Sunday storm hits, which completely launches the whole thing, scatters the family across Texas. And one daughter, whose name is Ruby Lee, ends up in Waco in a state home for children there. And her mother and other brothers are gone, lost somewhere, all various places around Texas trying to get by and trying to live again. And Ruby is bound and determined to get home, and she's heard nothing from her family and can't believe she's being left there. But Ruby was sent there in the first place because she had dust pneumonia, and it was a method of getting her away from the dust storms and helping her to breathe again. So I found that what was pretty typical of the time, and my research really unearthed this aspect of it, that it was pretty normal for state homes to pop up all around the country, but especially in Texas. If you were a parent a little down on your luck, maybe lost your job, whatever, you would drop your child off at the state home with the hope that once things got better for you, you would go back and pick your child up. They weren't orphanages, they were state homes. But in reality, they ended up housing a lot of children all the way up until they were 17, and then they were no longer qualified to be there. So that was one of the most sweeping little movements I saw as I was doing my research, and I thought that would really impact a character who thought she was being sent away for her own good, but eventually she's stuck in a family home like a state home like that. How could she get home? How could she put her family back together, rebuild her farm, remake the life that she's always dreamed of?
So I have a history degree undergrad, so I love history and fancy myself a historian from time to time. And I really wanted to use as an introduction to explore with you your blending of fact and fiction to make the history part of this
Mhm,
so accessible and engaging for people who, frankly, may not have ever read The Grapes of Wrath or may have heard or maybe not
mhm,
have even heard of a Dust Bowl.
mhm. I was meticulous in putting my historic events and occurrences that I have in the book about putting them in exact context, exact time and place. And there are a number of surprising things that occurred that I don't want to talk about because they're spoilers, but there's a number of surprising historical events that I uncovered that made terrific opportunities in my book. And although my characters are all completely mythical, they're composites of the kind of people that lived in those times. And again, that was because I looked at oral histories and the Library of Congress has a deep wealth of oral histories if you're ever interested in diving into certain area of what people do. And I wrote a scene where someone learns how to fly based on descriptions that were I found in the oral histories of World War II women learning how to fly. I placed all of that in the context of the times and tried to put it in the bigger history also of what was going on around them that they may or may not have known.
You have an upcoming book launch for Unspoken, and before we get to that, I just wanted to ask, what do you want readers to take away from this book? You want them to have fun? Do you want them to learn? Do you want them to be intrigued? Do you want them to ask questions? All of the above? None of the above? What do you want readers to get out of this?
I want readers to come away with so many questions because it's the kind of book I want to read. I want them to feel like, what would they do if they were in that situation? That is exactly the kind of book I always want to read. And I'm drawn to historical fiction for that reason, because that's what you can try to imagine an event that you never knew much about. What if you landed right in the middle of it? And I want them to know a little bit more about what the life was like there and what the challenges are that we faced then, and to hopefully make some comparisons to things that go on today. For one thing, this was the largest mass migration that we've ever had in the United States. 2.5 million people left the Great Plains state during this time, and 500,000 people left homeless. It was the biggest ecological disaster we've ever experienced. And yet we can see that we're sometimes on the cusp of some of those things again in a different way. So I think it's so relevant to know more about history and understand how it repeats, how it influences us today, how we do or don't react to it, and what we do and don't do in the face of terrifying, calamitous events.
I now know that you have a weekly blog and a newsletter. So could you tell us about, I don't want to call it outreach, but what you make available to your fans or others on your website, what your website is, and then tell us about the Zoom book launch.
Okay, that sounds great. The website is my name, jannalexander.com, and there's two N's in Jan. I always have to remind everyone of that. And I blog weekly, and I have done it forever on creative things. So it's called pairings, and I try to pair creative things. And history is a big thing I pair in there now because I'm relating it to what I'm writing. But pretty much anything relating to photos and art and any creative mix. I like to put book reviews on there. I've been reviewing some books that are interesting that I post about. And I also offer to people who subscribe to my newsletter, which is not a barraging newsletter, but it's an occasional newsletter, uh, little advanced reviews, sneak peeks ahead of time of what I'll be posting on my blog, or advanced reviews I've been able to do for other authors of interesting books that are coming. I put some insider tips and program and things about my book and its launch. And I have a short story currently that's free to download called Homeless when you do that, when you subscribe. And my book launch will eventually come up July 3rd. So the book is available for pre order now wherever books are sold. But on July 3rd, it's officially the publication date of it. And that's when you can walk into a bookstore and buy it or just buy it overnight, whatever you'd like to do. And I'm doing a virtual launch on Zoom on July 3rd. Anyone's invited to come that would like to. Just go to my website and RSVP that you'd like to come. And it will be in a book club type format. So a couple of other authors and readers who have read my book will be on the panel talking amongst themselves as though a book club would, talking with me about my book. And I'll be doing a little bit of background on the Dust Bowl and its relevance and try to make it a little more fun than just a talking head.
Well, Jan, this has been an absolutely delightful time for me, but unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. You've given us a lot of information, but I wanted to end by asking if our listeners wanted to connect with you, get your website again, what would be the best place for them to go or way for them to?
Oh, thanks. The best place to go is janalexander.com. And I'd love to connect with you on social. It's all right there. You can see my mailing list and sign up if you'd like to get my newsletter. And if you want to read my blog, it's janalexander.com/blog. It's all right there. So it'd be great to hear from everybody and to have you come to my book launch too.
Jan, I wanted to thank you again for this. I really look forward to your book launch, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure to be here and talk with you.